Well, if you're a Big 12 fan, you've probably spent the last couple of days trying to figure out what the heck is going on in this conference when it comes to who is going to Arlington for the Big 12 championship. We're here to help you figure it out at Heartland College Sports. I'm Pete Mundo. He is Bryan Clinton, our managing editor, who spent all of Monday afternoon trying to figure this whole darn thing out. And now we're bringing it to you on YouTube Live, on Facebook Live, on the podcast. So as always, you know what to do. Hit that thumbs up on the YouTube video. Subscribe to us on the podcast. And Bryan also hosts our podcast that we do with him, the Portal Podcast, talking everything transfer portal, recruiting. Be sure to go check that out on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right. First things first, Bryan, I'll talk about the games, how we got here, but can we do this without confusing the hell out of people? Is it possible to do that?
I'm not sure. I'm going to do my absolute best. I'll just say this. When you're looking around at several different people who I would say are reputable sources on the Big 12 saying different things on Twitter 3 or 4 days after all of this has happened, I would say the confusion is probably just going to happen at this point, but we're going to do it together. So
we're going to do it together, and we're going to walk you through this thing team by team. So how did we get here? Of course, on Saturday, the biggest issue, for lack of a better word, was Oklahoma State getting its doors blown off by UCF 45-3. The other games that play a factor here, in some way, almost every game plays a factor right now and will play a factor. But, of course, Texas hung on to beat TCU 29-26. They're in sole possession of first place. Kansas lost to Texas Tech. They're more or less out of the running. Oklahoma blasting West Virginia 59-20. Kansas State rolls Baylor 59-25. And Iowa State beat up on BYU 45-13. So the standings right now, you've got Texas at 6-1, and then you have 4 teams sitting at 5-2. Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, Iowa State, and Kansas State. So these are the teams right now you're looking at and saying, okay, which one of these two are going to Arlington? In the old Big 12 days, this was easy. Round robin, everybody played everybody, but that's not the case anymore. So now you got to figure out some kind of tiebreaker situation. And that's where this gets hairy. So, Bryan, I'm just going to set it up like this. If we have 2 teams that end the season, let's say at 7-2, and Texas is 8-1. If those 2 teams, let's say it's Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, they're each 7-2. Obviously, head-to-head matters, right? Head-to-head matters if it's only 2 teams that are tied with the same record, if they have a head-to-head.
Yes. Yep. 7-2, okay. 7-2, Oklahoma State. It would be Oklahoma State. Moving on.
All right. 7-2. Let's say it's 7-2 Oklahoma State and 7-2 Kansas State. Oklahoma State moves on.
Correct.
Simple as that. All right. So head-to-heads, we understand. If it's Iowa State, well, let's not even go there because Iowa State plays Texas. But let's just right out of the gates make it clear. If it's just 2 teams and they've met, obviously head-to-head matters. But then it gets hairy. So where do you want to start with the chaos? Let's start with Oklahoma State, I guess, right? Okay. Yep. What does Oklahoma State need to have happen to find itself in the Big 12 championship game? Let's start with the Cowboys.
Okay, so everybody besides Texas has to win out for them to get in. Okay. You've got to win both games remaining on the schedule. So that is the first thing with Oklahoma State. They've got to beat Houston on November 18th, and they have to beat BYU on November 25th. Okay. Barring other teams dropping both games and absolute chaos and pandemonium breaking out, that has to happen. Besides that, Oklahoma State has 2 viable paths to making the Big 12 championship. They need a loss from either Kansas State or OU. They need one of those 2 teams to lose. Now, Oklahoma State fans who are saying, well, we beat both of those teams. Why does that matter? If one of those teams loses, you put yourself in a situation to be in a 2-way tie with the other team, which would move you on to the Big 12 championship.
Okay, so even though you could have Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, and Kansas State end in a 3-way tie for second place, and Oklahoma State has beaten both of those teams in head-to-heads, it will be meaningless because of how the Big 12 has set up its tiebreaker system in a multi-way tie, meaning at least 3 teams in a tie for first or second place.
Correct. Yes. So reason being, given how things would play out with those teams winning out, you would have a Kansas team sitting as the highest ranked common opponent between all three of those schools.
Okay.
And so, with that being said, the first team to be eliminated from the three-way tie would be Oklahoma. They're the only team that would have lost to Kansas in this scenario. So you
Yep.
drop Oklahoma out of there. You have to remain with the same tiebreaker to decide the other two here. So your next highest ranked opponent in Big 12 standings in this case would be Iowa State. If this were in fact to happen and you have 3, 7, and 2 teams between Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Kansas State, that would mean Iowa State took a loss to the Wildcats, but Iowa State beat Oklahoma State earlier in the season. So that's why Kansas State would move on and Oklahoma State would be on the outside looking in.
Man. Okay. All right. So Oklahoma State fans are going to be going nuts right now hearing this. And by the way, I completely sympathize with them in this scenario. And we're going to get to what a disaster this tiebreaker is. But Oklahoma State can finish 7-2, can win the next 2 games. Kansas State can finish 7-2 as well, as can Oklahoma. They need all 3 things to happen because remember, this system that we're talking about is only if there's at least 3 teams in the tie. If Oklahoma drops one of its next 2 games and Kansas State and Oklahoma State are both 7-2, then that's where the head-to-head comes into play here.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we're following along here. All right. So we're all on the same page. So we talked to Oklahoma State. Let's next go to the Oklahoma Sooners, who looked dead in the water after the Bedlam loss, but they're right back in the thick of this thing. How does Oklahoma get to a Big 12 championship game? Since they also have, of course, the tiebreaker over Texas, which has got to be worth something.
Right. So with Oklahoma, as I said earlier, you've got to win out, but you also would need either a Texas loss, an Oklahoma State loss, or and here's the one that's just going to throw everybody for a loop. If they win out, Oklahoma State wins out, Kansas State wins out, but Kansas goes 0-2, the Sooners would get in with that 3-way tiebreaker rather than Kansas State or Oklahoma State.
So you're saying if Cincinnati beats Kansas in week 13.
Correct.
So suddenly all of Norman, who couldn't pick Cincinnati out on a map back in August, is going to be rooting hard for the Bearcats in week 13.
Absolutely. Yes. So reason being, if Cincinnati beats Kansas, it would bring Iowa State up 1 spot and Iowa State would become the highest ranked team in that 3-way tie as far as a common opponent goes. Oklahoma would have a win there. Kansas State would have a win there, but Oklahoma State would have a loss. So it would eliminate the Pokes. Then the highest common opponent between Oklahoma and Kansas State is Texas, which Oklahoma beat. Kansas State did not. Therefore, Oklahoma would move on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. Now, why does Texas get the consideration over or after Iowa State?
So that is where Texas is in a very unique situation. Texas could either win out or they could just beat Iowa State this week and get in.
Okay.
If either of those things happen, they are in.
So they're in if they get a win this weekend.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, if they were to lose this weekend, they would need to beat Texas Tech and have Oklahoma lose somewhere along the way to get in, because Oklahoma is the one team to have a tiebreaker over them, as would Iowa State. But, things get so convoluted at that point, it's almost impossible for me to tell you who would get in.
That gets really hairy. All right, next up, let's talk about Iowa State sitting there at 5-2 right now. They have the toughest schedule left, I would say, of any of these teams, of course. They have Texas, and then they've got Kansas State to wrap up the season. What is Iowa State's path to a Big 12 championship?
This one it's the most cut and dry. This is the easiest one to explain because with their remaining schedule being Texas and Kansas State, they can gain a tiebreaker over either of those teams. Obviously, would send Kansas State with one more loss if they were to win out. They would need to win out and have either Oklahoma or Oklahoma State drop a game. With
so they
them,
win out, and then one of the Oklahoma teams has to lose a game.
correct.
Okay. All right. So that's tough sledding. So they got to win out, and they've got to have one of the Oklahoma teams at least drop a game, and both the Oklahoma teams are going to be favored in both of their remaining games.
Correct.
So they got to have an upset there and win out.
Yes.
Now, even though, let's say Iowa State wins out and they're 7-2, and let's say Texas loses this weekend to Iowa State, but then beats Texas Tech, they're 7-2.
Mm-hmm.
And then Oklahoma, let's say they're 7-2, and Oklahoma State 7-2. I mean, I don't want to get too far in the weeds here. Do you have that on your big board there?
I do. Iowa State would get left out in that scenario. So Oklahoma State and Oklahoma would be the matchups in that Big 12 championship, which is just insane.
So that would be a Bedlam rematch.
It would be, yes.
Bedlam. So if Iowa State wins out, Texas would have to lose this weekend, but then beats Texas Tech, and the Oklahoma teams win out. That's four teams at 7-2.
Yep.
And in that scenario, you're saying it's a Bedlam rematch for the Big 12 championship.
It would be, because you would have a 4-way tie at 7-2 with Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, Iowa State, and Texas.
Okay.
Oklahoma State gets the head-to-head edge over Oklahoma, obviously, but we are with a 4-way tie. We're going with common opponents. The only common opponent with those four teams is Kansas.
The only common opponent with those four teams is Kansas.
Yes. And so with all of those teams playing Kansas, you would have OSU and Texas being the teams with wins. However, because we're only able to eliminate one team at a time in this situation, you've got Oklahoma and Iowa State moving ahead in this, with Texas having a loss to Iowa State and Oklahoma in this situation.
Wait. Stop this garbage. And this, I'm not mad at Bryan, but do you hear and listen, nobody has dug into this like Bryan has today. Think about this trash that we're talking about here. This is ridiculous from the Big 12. You can have a scenario. Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, and Texas all finish 7-2. And we got to find a common opponent. And the common opponent you're telling me is Kansas, right?
Yes.
Highest ranked common opponent is Kansas.
Yep.
You guys on the Facebook and YouTube talking about head-to-heads, stop with the head-to-heads. It doesn't matter. The head-to-heads don't matter in a 3 or more way tie. We got to understand that right out of the gates. The head-to-heads don't matter. It's stupid. It's ridiculous, but you got to stop worrying about the head-to-heads. So it's about common opponent they've all faced. That would be Kansas. But you're saying you can only eliminate one team at a time.
Correct.
So how do you decide which one to eliminate?
So that's where the head-to-heads come back into
Okay. So now we're going back. Now we're going back to head-to-head.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
It's a mess. It's an absolute mess.
Okay. So then we're going back to your point. The two teams who lost to Kansas are Oklahoma, Iowa State, but only Iowa State gets eliminated because then the head-to-head matters and Oklahoma beat Iowa State.
Texas would get eliminated because Iowa State would have a win over Texas in this scenario. So it would come down to Oklahoma, Iowa State, and then
it would come down to Oklahoma, Iowa State.
Correct. I know it's absolute. So you've got Oklahoma State there sitting atop at 7-2. They would be technically your 1 seed because they would be based on record and common conference opponents. They would be 5-1 with everybody that they've played equal times. Oklahoma would be the 2nd seed because they are above Iowa State and Texas based on a round robin format between the 3 teams.
Okay.
So Oklahoma would be 2-0 against Iowa State and Texas. Therefore, Oklahoma would move forward and Iowa State and Texas would be left out.
Okay. All right. So to be clear, if Iowa State wins out and the Oklahoma teams win out, we get Bedlam.
Correct.
So what's the path to Iowa State? Because I know Iowa State fans are going to ask this. What is the path to Iowa State making a Big 12 championship? Because they have to win out, but they also need some help.
Yes, they have to have Oklahoma State lose one game or Oklahoma lose one game. If either of those teams win, that's how they get in. So the way that works out is if Oklahoma drops a game, Iowa State would get in based off of their head-to-head win over Texas at this point. So they would get in over Texas, and Oklahoma would be out. If Oklahoma State was to drop a game, the Cyclones would advance because they would have a round-robin tiebreaker over both the Pokes and Texas, being 2-0 against those teams, since all three of those teams have played one another.
Holy crap. Okay. All right. Now, Kansas State actually has a pretty simple path compared to what we just talked about with Iowa State. So the Kansas State path, obviously, win out, Kansas, Iowa State, tough sledding, but got to win out. And then what has to happen for Kansas State?
So Kansas State need to be big Oklahoma and Oklahoma State fans. If Kansas State can take care of business and all three of those teams go 7-2, Kansas State would get in based off of the tiebreaker we spoke about at the beginning. They would get in because Kansas would be the highest ranked common opponent at first, and then the second highest ranked would be Iowa State, which would eliminate Oklahoma first and Oklahoma State second in that scenario.
Okay. So
now another way that Kansas State could get in is if they win out and Texas loses. Because if
they win out and Texas loses.
Correct. Okay. If they were able to win out and Texas loses somewhere along the way, that opens up the door for Kansas State to get in.
But how crazy is that? If Texas loses one game and Kansas State wins out, they're both 7-2. And once again, the head-to-head for Texas against Kansas State is meaningless.
Right. So you're coming into, again, that's where things get so convoluted into week 13 that it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen with the Oklahoma schools, and Iowa State also tied into all of that.
Wow. Okay. Is there a scenario we haven't talked about yet?
Oh, man.
I mean, I know there's a million different avenues we can go down.
There are.
But I think we talked about most of it, right? Is there anything obvious we've missed?
Let's talk about if Texas was to lose both games. If they were to drop, let's just play crazy here. Let's say Iowa State beats them. Jonathan Brooks is out. Iowa State beats him in Ames, and then Joey McGuire goes and gets it done in Austin on Thanksgiving, on
Black Friday
there.
Yep.
This is gonna blow some people's minds, I think. That is another situation where you would have Bedlam again in a Bedlam rematch. So you would have three teams, hypothetically speaking here, at 7-2, with Iowa State at 7-2, Oklahoma at 7-2, and Oklahoma State at 7-2. Your highest ranked common opponent there your highest ranked common opponent there would be Kansas. Kansas beat both Oklahoma and Iowa State, but they lost to Oklahoma State. So Oklahoma State would get the first seed there. Your next highest common opponent between those two is Texas, which both teams won. And we get down eventually to, I believe, who we're looking at here. Excuse me. I said all that too much. Oklahoma and Iowa State have head-to-head. So after Oklahoma State moves forward with the 1 seed, Oklahoma has beaten Iowa State. The head-to-head then matters at that point. And the
head-to-head matters then because there's only two teams in that tie once one team has been selected to move on.
Yes.
Okay. I understand there's a lot of people listening, watching who are beyond confused. I'm beyond confused. Bryan spent all afternoon on this.
I'm so sorry. I tried.
No. Listen, there's no good way for you to do this.
Yeah.
This is not your fault. Let me be very clear. This is not your fault. You've done nothing wrong here. You're not getting fired. You've done your job. Somebody at the Big 12 has to be fired for the dumbest idea of tiebreakers I've ever seen in my life in any sport I've ever seen in my life.
Well, and here's the issue. Where everybody is going away for years and years, we have had a a format in conferences where you have divisions.
Yep.
This is one of those issues that nobody was talking about whenever divisions were taken away, because now you don't have a round robin schedule on either side to determine what two teams should go. So it's going to become a problem not just in the Big 12 but everywhere. And eventually you almost have to move to some sort of tournament format for it to work out without there being somebody getting screwed, because at some point, probably even this year, there's going to be a team left out that feels like they shouldn't be. I mean, Oklahoma State fans would have every right in the world to be totally upset if Kansas State or Oklahoma was to get in over them after they beat both of those teams.
Yeah, but that's entirely possible. Now, you could also say, hey, don't get smashed by UCF, and this is not a problem.
Correct.
But still, I mean, I'm still sitting here saying this is completely unfair. You're going to have 2 head-to-head wins, and either of those teams could get in over you if you're Oklahoma State, and that's going to drive you nuts.
Mm-hmm.
I just without, and this is probably a postseason conversation. I just don't understand how, if you have a multi-way tie, head-to-head is thrown out the window. I understand you want to go after the common opponent, but if you've got 3 teams, how does head-to-head not be the first thing that you consider to start eliminating teams? Who gives a rip about a common opponent? They played each other. There's your common opponent. How about that?
Well, and the only reason that it's not is because it's no longer round robin at this point. With Oklahoma State and Kansas State and Oklahoma being the teams tied in this scenario, which we've been talking about, Kansas State and Oklahoma never played each other this year. So with that being the issue, that's why the head-to-head no longer matters, because you can't compare the other two teams to each other. Now, again,
but here's the thing.
That's why it's a dumb rule, because Oklahoma State has beaten both of them, so it shouldn't matter.
But here's the thing: if the 3-way tie is Iowa State, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, the head-to-heads still don't matter because it's a 3-way tie.
But they have played each other, so the round robin in that scenario would be 1-1-1, and then you would have to fall to the highest common opponent.
Oh, okay, because everyone would be 1-1 between those 3 teams.
Yes.
So then you'd go down to highest common opponent in that situation.
Correct.
Wow. What a mess.
Yep.
I mean, hold on. I'm just going to reiterate this. Daniel popped this up on Facebook. No way Texas and Oklahoma State get in if Iowa State wins out. Iowa State would have wins over both of them. That's Daniel. That's not how it's working out, brother. We're trying to help. The head-to-head is not going to matter in that case. That's what this show is all about, how jacked up the Big 12 tiebreaker rules are. I know it makes sense in our simpleton heads, and I'm including myself in that Iowa State beats Texas, beats Kansas State. They can absolutely and have a win over Oklahoma State and not get in. That's what makes this so ridiculous. All right, Bryan, final thoughts here. Make sense of the senseless of the, nonsense we've been talking about tonight.
Make a change, please.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to do this every year for the rest of eternity. No, I mean, what more could you ask for, honestly? I mean, when's the last time? I know that somebody's going to end up being upset about how all the fan bases are going to be upset when they get left out. But when's the last time that the Big 12 race was this much fun going into Week 12 and Week 13? I mean, we're talking about just an absolute photo finish. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited about it.
Yeah. So, by the way, if you want to see this broken down, it is on the website at heartlandcollegesports.com. That's the lead story right now. Bryan wrote it. Share it with your friends, family. Understand the head-to-head, for the most part, is not going to matter in a multi-way tie. So share that article around. Also, we're talking about it on our message boards. Those are free. Get on the message board. Sign up now. I'm on there. Bryan's on there. We're talking about this craziness with a tiebreaker. So be sure to hop on and try to make sense of this. So, Bryan, well done, man. We appreciate your hard work on the issue, and we'll be following here on Saturday, and then we'll do this again next week because something tells me next week might be pretty crazy as well.
I agree. Thanks for having me on, Pete.
All right. He's Bryan Clinton, our managing editor at Heartland College Sports. Be sure to check out the article on the website, and be sure you're subscribed to this channel, by the way, whether it's on YouTube, whether it is on the podcast. Hit that subscribe button. And as always, you leave that 5-star rating and review on iTunes. You get that Heartland College Sports koozie. when you send me a screenshot to Pete Mundo, MUNDO, at heartlandcollegesports.com. Have a great rest of the day. Try to not have your head spinning after that conversation, but share it, because this is where you want to be to figure out what the heck's going on the next 2 weeks in the Big 12. I'm Pete Mundo. He's Bryan Clinton. HeartlandCollegeSports.com is where you find us. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.